So, welcome class to the third week of Philosophy 101. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about thesis development in writing philosophy papers and give you a few more tips for actually reading philosophy. This is the first week when you have major primary sources to analyze rather than just little summary articles about philosophy. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about Socrates and the act of Socratic questioning. And also I'm going to outline some of Plato's organizing concepts. Your reading material will not cover all of this, so this is essential that you digest this a little bit too. So the elements of a strong paper, I'm actually taking this from a book about student work writing philosophy papers. I think Vaughn has some very clear ideas. So the first thing is that a clear thesis statement, it needs to shape, you need to have a clear thesis statement that shapes your entire paper. And this thesis is the core identity of your paper. So you have to think about that as your major organizing argument. Now, the shape of a philosophy paper, so this is directly from his text on page 56. He recommends, and I really like this formulaic approach, that your introduction should include, your thesis, your plan for your paper, and any background supportive information on your thesis. So if your thesis is mainly, the conclusion of the argument, it would be helpful to have a little bit of the premises outlined in, at least at the first level in the introduction. The second part of your essay really should be whatever arguments that you are proposing that support your thesis. And then, so that could be a few paragraphs. And then after that, you can include an assessment of objections. So think of it this way. You're like a defense attorney or a prosecuting attorney who is summarizing why the arguments of your opponent are not strong. But the key factor here is that you want to fairly assess objections to your thesis. And then you have a conclusion. So in a strong philosophy paper, you really want to avoid passive voice. The royal we, third person. You want to avoid discriminatory language, fallacious reasoning. So all the things we talked about last week, in last week's lecture and in the article on proving your thinking, to avoid fallacious reasoning, avoid ridiculing opponents, overstating your case, or hiding behind pretentious language. You really can, this is what's so different about philosophy papers, use first person. Don't avoid first person. I know all your English teachers told you to, but that's just not how it rolls in philosophy papers. You're going to write clearly and directly to your audience. And I want you to consider that your audience, who is your audience? That's right, it's me. And I'm a reasonably intelligent 10-year-old. I don't need fancy language. So we'll talk more about questions about this in our first conference. So this is a way, and as you're looking at your discussion, as you're analyzing one of Plato's arguments, really hunt for the author's thesis. Keep asking yourself, what is Plato saying here? It's helpful to identify the conclusion first and then the premises. And you want to, when you are having trouble, especially if it's not easily identifiable, you need to actually outline, paraphrase, and or summarize the author's arguments. So you have to really dig in a little bit to this. The readings aren't very long, but you have to spend a little bit of time on them. And then you're also going to evaluate the arguments. That's part of what you're doing. you're going to make a judgment, about the strength of the argument. Now remember, I don't want you to get too hung up about worrying about the validity of arguments. Unless you're really going a step further in the domain of philosophy and you've had a logic course or a critical thinking course behind you, you can't really do that. So I know that there's a PowerPoint that has quite a bit on Socrates. So I just wanted to remind you that Socrates wrote nothing. So while the Oracle of Delphi is said to have pronounced Socrates the wisest of people, and this is alluded to in the defense of Socrates, and Socrates claimed this just meant that he was aware of his own ignorance. But I think the greatest legacy of Socrates is this questioning method that he engaged in. And we can see it illustrated in the dialogues of Plato. So when we see this character, Socrates, going back and forth, that is illustrating the Socratic method, asking a question, asking clarifying questions to reach understanding, which is a dialectical method. Okay, now I don't know what you guys are going to think about this, but I'm not trying to rile up emotions or appeal to emotion. But it just struck me, I had several conversations with some colleagues about other things, that in fact, the defense of Socrates and the whole idea of Socrates choosing to take hemlock over downgrading what he was saying is a little bit like the sentiment behind the Nike ad. So notice that even of me putting this up here, some of you may get mad at me. Or some of you may be like, right on. So notice that emotional tendency, right? I'm not trying to suggest that Nike is a virtuous company. I'm just saying that the ad campaign alludes to this kind of spirit of believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. That's essentially what the defense of Socrates is about. So what do you think about that? And you tell this little slide is an argument in and of itself, right? So Plato's name was actually Aristocles, and the name Plato was a nickname that meant broad shoulders. So he first studied with a follower of Heraclitus. Remember, Heraclitus was the pre-Socratic that I said was very similar in thought to the Buddha, actually. And then he was a student of Socrates. The other thing that's important to note is that Plato was very influenced by the Pythagoreans and the followers of Pythagoras, who thought that math was a necessary introduction to philosophy. Math is a structural reality that's part of our rational a priori knowledge. The other fact I want to mention is that Plato founded the Academy in 387 B.C.E., which was essentially the first university in the West. So lastly, I want to talk about the essence of his philosophy, kind of the whole metaphysics and epistemology of Plato's thought. So actually, his probably most famous dialogue is The Republic. It's very long. You're only getting one little segment of it, and we're not even reading the Allegory of the Cave, or the myth, which is also called the Myth of the Cave. So if you don't know about it yet, here's an image about the Allegory of the Cave. So in this story, Plato talks about the fact that in reality, most of humanity are like prisoners. They're prisoners who are are bound and can only see shadows of reality that are cast on a wall. And it only comes from a fire source, not even from sunlight. So in this allegory of the cave, one of the prisoners breaks free. And one of the prisoners breaks free and escapes and goes up out, all the way out of the cave into the sunlight. And they realize that what they have been looking at is fake news. And so they run back down the stairway and they try and tell the other prisoners that what they're seeing is not real. It's false. But the other prisoners don't want to believe them. So there's an extended conversation about the people who then break free and go out to the sunlight become what Plato calls guardians, because they're actually in touch with the reality, but even more so, the unseen reality that's even beyond the real sunlight. So this allegory of the cave sets up all of Plato's ideas about metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and political philosophy. So we have to kind of keep coming back to this, and it's all in the Republic. So the idea is what people see in normal humanity is actually on this lower level of seeing only images which are just conjecture. They haven't even gotten to the visible world of the sun yet. So in fact, a lot of people in the cave are even below this chart here. He says most people are just stuck and not actually seeing what's really, or understanding reality as it is. So Plato has a very hierarchical way of understanding reality, and even a very mystical way of seeing reality. And the reason I'm using that language is because it's one way to talk about the idea that what we see in everyday reality is not what's real. There's something else out there beyond what we see that is in fact the highest form of knowledge or pure reason, which is the forms and the good. So we're going to build on this idea, and we're going to have to kind of keep wrapping our mind around this notion that, remember, this is before organized scientific inquiry. But there was, we could tell in the pre-Socratics that they were exploring scientific ideas, but there was still a notion that our senses, our regular sensory perceptions, were deceptive. So this is actually a common thread between Plato's philosophy and many of the Hindu philosophers of the same era. So here's one way to take the hierarchy of the theory of the forms and kind of unpack it. So in the theory of the forms, the form of beauty is the highest form. That's something that we don't see. The next level is the concept of beauty within individuals, or the thought of beauty. And then the next is the individual beautiful objects, or sort of more detailed things, people, landscape. And the lowest level is imitations of beautiful things, paintings, photos, reflections, shadows. So you can see why when he's talking in the selection from the Republic on artists, why he is diminishing the work of artists, because they are creating imitations of beautiful things rather than the highest form of beauty, which cannot be contained in a material form. It's a little out there. You know, we are conditioned with a whole other set of ideas. So this is going to sound strange to you, I would imagine. Okay. Look forward to talking to you more about this. And those are my references.